The courthouse was quiet that afternoon, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur of the bailiff. In the wooden-paneled courtroom, Judge John Parker sat behind his bench, his stern face a mask of indifference as he sifted through a stack of cases. He'd seen it all over the years, the petty traffic violations, the occasional domestic dispute, and the numerous individuals who walked through the courtroom doors looking to make their way in a world of rules and regulations. Today, however, something felt slightly different, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Tasha Williams, in her early 30s, stood at the front of the courtroom, her calm demeanor and poised presence contrasting sharply with the bustle of a typical courthouse scene. She wore a crisp blouse and dark slacks, her short natural hair framing her face with effortless grace. She had always carried herself with confidence, but today, as she stood before the judge, her thoughts were already elsewhere. A quiet strength radiated from her, and while she had no idea that her presence would soon spark a shift in the judge's life, she was already mentally preparing for the next chapter in her work. Judge Parker's eyes scanned her file quickly, a routine stop. She'd been pulled over for speeding in a school zone. The ticket had been issued without much thought, and now it was time for him to do his part. He was used to making quick decisions, handing out fines without hesitation, an efficient operator in the system he'd known for years. His gaze was cold and neutral as he addressed her. "Ms. Williams," Judge Parker said, his voice measured, "you're being fined $250 for speeding in a school zone. It's a serious offense, especially in a place where children are present. I trust you understand the importance of following traffic laws." Tasha nodded politely, her face betraying no emotion. "Yes, Your Honor," she said simply. She'd been speeding, yes, but the circumstances were more complicated. She had been rushing to a meeting that could affect her work on a national policy proposal she had spent years crafting. Yet she didn't need to explain herself to the judge. The law was clear, and she had no intention of arguing. The courtroom murmured for a moment as the decision was made, but nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. Judge Parker moved on to the next case, while Tasha stood there, the fine already a distant concern in her mind. She paid little attention to the dismissal of her case, her thoughts still preoccupied with the advocacy work that lay ahead. She didn't see Judge Parker glance at her as she left the courtroom, her composure leaving an impression on him. She exited the courthouse, her focus already turning to the broader mission ahead, unaware that the quiet exchange between them would be the catalyst for a surprising twist in both their lives. As Tasha Williams stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air wrapped around her like a brief but comforting embrace. She paused for a moment, glancing at her phone as a series of urgent texts from her colleagues flashed across the screen. They were preparing for a major strategy meeting the next day, one that could change the trajectory of her life's work. She had been running late, but now that the court case was over, her mind returned to the bigger picture. Tasha was no ordinary citizen. Beneath the calm exterior that Judge Parker had seen that afternoon lay a woman with an unyielding commitment to reforming the nation's gun safety laws. She had spent the last 5 years drafting policy proposals, meeting with lawmakers, and organizing coalitions of activists. Her work focused on tightening the loopholes in the nation's gun control laws, advocating for universal background checks, mandatory safety training, and legislation that would require more responsible ownership. Her passion for this cause was deeply personal. Years ago, Tasha had experienced a devastating loss when her cousin, Marcus, was killed in a senseless act of gun violence. He had been a young father and a promising entrepreneur, someone who had been working hard to provide for his family. His death shook her to her core, and it ignited a fire within her to make sure that no one else had to experience the same pain. From that moment on, Tasha became determined to be a part of the solution. She put her law degree to use, first representing victims of gun violence, and later shifting her focus toward policy. It wasn't long before she was invited to work with a prominent coalition of gun safety advocates in Washington, D.C. That was where she began drafting the proposal that would eventually become one of the most talked about pieces of legislation in the country. The bill aimed to strengthen federal laws around gun ownership, with a specific focus on reducing gun violence while preserving the rights of law-abiding citizens. Though the proposal had garnered support from many public figures and organizations, it had also faced fierce opposition from pro-gun advocates. Still, Tasha remained undeterred, confident that the changes she was fighting for were not only needed but urgent. In her mind, the risks were too high, and the stakes were too great to let politics get in the way. She worked tirelessly, poring over data, drafting new amendments, and negotiating with lawmakers who were reluctant to sign on to the plan. As Tasha sat in her car, preparing for the meeting ahead, she reflected on just how far she had come. She was no longer the young woman who had lost her cousin to senseless violence. She was a force to be reckoned with, a leading advocate who had the power to shape the future of gun safety in America. But none of that was on Judge Parker's radar when she stepped before him in his courtroom earlier that day. He had no idea that the woman he'd find was one of the most important voices in the fight for a safer future. And neither did she. Yet their paths had crossed, and the ripples from that brief encounter would soon be felt in ways neither of them could have imagined. In the months following Tasha's courtroom appearance, her life continued at a relentless pace. The national gun safety proposal she had helped draft was finally getting the attention it deserved. As the bill made its way through Congress, Tasha's phone never seemed to stop buzzing. Calls, texts, emails, all from journalists, activists, and political figures eager to weigh in on the landmark legislation. The proposal was simple but far-reaching. It called for universal background checks for all gun purchases, mandatory safety training for first-time gun owners, and a national database to track firearms more effectively. There was also a provision to hold gun manufacturers accountable for any incidents involving faulty products. The goal was to prevent violence while still respecting the rights of responsible gun owners. It was a delicate balance, and Tasha knew it. The media coverage was both a blessing and a curse. The bill sparked fierce debates, dividing the nation along predictable lines. Gun rights groups immediately pushed back, accusing the proposal of infringing on the Second Amendment. They argued that the government should not be allowed to impose further restrictions on gun ownership, especially when there was little evidence that such measures would reduce crime. Tasha knew that the opposition would be loud, but she was prepared for it. The support, however, was equally strong. Families of victims, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens who had seen the devastation caused by gun violence rallied behind the proposal. They told stories of children killed in school shootings, of families torn apart by gun-related tragedies, and of the trauma that so many people lived with every day. Tasha's own story, one of loss and resilience, was at the heart of the bill. She had spoken publicly about her cousin Marcus's death, and her words resonated with those who had lost loved ones to similar violence. Despite the support, progress was slow. Politicians, many of whom had personal or financial ties to pro-gun organizations, were reluctant to back the bill. Yet, Tasha was not one to back down. She spent hours meeting with lawmakers, sometimes one by one, sometimes in groups. She was patient but firm, always reminding them of the stakes, the lives that could be saved if the law passed, the families who might find peace in knowing that something was being done to prevent future tragedy. By the time the bill was ready for a full vote, it had become a point of intense national debate. Political pundits speculated on whether it had a chance of passing. Tasha watched the developments from her office in Washington, where the pressure was mounting, but she stayed focused. This wasn't just about politics for her. It was about making sure no one else would have to bury a loved one because of gun violence. She could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her every day. Little did she know, Judge Parker, the very same man who had fined her in that small-town courtroom months earlier, was about to learn something that would change his perception of her, and possibly his own stance on the issue. The ripples of their brief interaction were only beginning to unfold. Judge John Parker sat in his study one evening, nursing a cup of coffee as he scanned through the latest headlines. His mind had been preoccupied with the case he'd handled earlier that day. Nothing special, just another routine fine. But something about that woman, Tasha Williams, lingered in his thoughts. He had been struck by how composed she had been when accepting her penalty, almost as if she were unaffected by the court's decision. In a way, it bothered him. It was rare for someone to simply accept punishment without protest, especially for something as trivial as a traffic violation. His curiosity had been piqued, but he had no reason to follow up on it. It was just another case. Yet, as he browsed his tablet, a headline caught his eye. National Gun Safety Proposal Gains Momentum. Leading Advocate Reveals Personal Story of Loss. The name Tasha Williams jumped out at him. He clicked on the article, intrigued. The article described how Tasha had lost her cousin, Marcus, to gun violence and how that loss had spurred her to work on a national gun safety bill. The proposal was aimed at tightening laws around gun ownership, implementing stricter background checks, and requiring safety measures for first-time buyers. Judge Parker's eyebrows furrowed as he read further. He was well aware of the ongoing national debate surrounding gun laws, but what surprised him was the involvement of the very woman he had fined for speeding. The same woman who had stood before him earlier that day, calm, composed, almost too calm, was now revealed to be at the forefront of one of the most important policy battles in the country. He had no idea who she really was, nor did he understand the depth of her commitment. As he continued reading, he learned more about Tasha's work, and his mind began to race. How had he failed to recognize the significance of her presence in his courtroom? In all his years as a judge, he had met countless individuals from all walks of life, but none had left an impression like this. He felt a pang of guilt. Here was someone, a powerful voice for change, and he had reduced her to just another person who made a small mistake behind the wheel. The article also highlighted her unwavering commitment to the cause, despite the pushback from powerful pro-gun lobbyists. It painted her as a tireless advocate, one who had endured personal tragedy, yet remained undeterred in her pursuit of justice for others. Judge Parker's chest tightened as he closed the article. He had never considered the personal stories behind the policies that shaped the laws he upheld every day. He was a man of principle, yes, but was his principle always fair? Could his decision to find Tasha, a woman he now realized was fighting for something much bigger than himself, have been clouded by his own biases? Suddenly, he wasn't so sure. The small-town courtroom, and the woman he had so casually dismissed, had become much more significant in his mind. Judge Parker couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had settled in his chest after reading about Tasha Williams. The more he thought about her, about the fine he had imposed without a second thought, the more unsettled he became. He knew better than anyone the power that a single moment in a courtroom could have, the lasting effect a judge's decision could carry. Yet, in this case, he had acted impulsively. He had seen only the ticket and the violation, not the woman who had likely been working tirelessly to reshape the very laws he enforced. A week passed, and the uneasy feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. So, on a quiet morning when the court calendar was light, Judge Parker made a decision that surprised even him. He picked up the phone and called the number listed in the article. Tasha Williams, he said when the voice on the other end picked up. "This is Judge John Parker. We met briefly in court last week. I wanted to reach out." There was a pause on the line, and then Tasha responded, "Yes, I remember. What can I do for you, Judge Parker?" His words came slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about our interaction, and, well, I want to apologize. I find you without knowing anything about who you are or the work you're doing. It wasn't right, and I should have shown more understanding." Tasha, taken aback by the unexpected phone call, hesitated. She wasn't sure if this was a genuine apology or just a formality. But there was sincerity in his voice, and that gave her pause. "It's kind of you to call, Judge," she replied, her tone neutral but not dismissive. "I understand that you're just doing your job, but I appreciate the gesture. I think the courts have a bigger role to play in understanding people's stories, especially when it comes to the policies we're all working on." There was a brief silence on the line, and then Judge Parker spoke again. "I read about your work, about the bill you're pushing for. I didn't know any of this when you were in my courtroom. And after reading about your experiences, I have to admit, I feel I may have judged you too quickly." Tasha was quiet for a moment. This wasn't the typical exchange she was used to with people in power. Usually, there was resistance, not reflection. "You know," she said carefully, "it's funny how the law can make us quick to assume things about people. We often don't see the bigger picture, the experiences that shape who they are. I've worked on this proposal because I want to prevent others from going through what I did. But it's not always easy to make people understand." Judge Parker felt something shift within him as he listened to her. This conversation wasn't just about an apology. It was about something much larger, something he had been blind to until now. The law, in all its rigidity, could sometimes overlook the very human stories that demanded its attention. "I'd like to learn more, Tasha," he said, his voice steady now, a new resolve in his words. "If you're open to it, I'd like to meet and talk more about the work you're doing. Maybe I can help in some way." Tasha, surprised by his sincerity, agreed to meet. It was the beginning of an unexpected conversation that would soon grow into something more significant, an understanding that would change the trajectory of both their lives. A few days later, Tasha met Judge Parker at a local cafe, a small, unassuming place tucked away on a quiet street in Washington, D.C. The city hummed with energy just outside. But inside the cafe, the world seemed a little smaller, a little more intimate. As she walked in, she spotted him immediately, a man in his mid-50s, sitting at a corner table, nervously adjusting his glasses. He stood when she entered, a slight hint of unease in his demeanor, but he smiled warmly as she approached. "Ms. Williams, it's good to finally meet you in person," Judge Parker said, offering a handshake. Tasha returned the handshake, studying his face. He didn't look like the stern, impersonal judge she had seen in court. Instead, his eyes seemed softer, more curious, as if he genuinely wanted to understand who she was beyond the fine she had received. She took a seat, ordering coffee for herself before turning her attention back to him. "I was surprised you wanted to meet," she said, her tone still cautious, though she was willing to give him a chance. "I didn't expect much after the courtroom. Usually, people just forget once the case is over." Judge Parker nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know. But after reading about your work, I realized how little I understood. You spent years advocating for a cause that, honestly, I never gave much thought to. I've always followed the law, but it wasn't until I read about your efforts and the personal loss you faced that I started questioning whether I've been missing the bigger picture." Tasha studied him quietly, surprised by his level of introspection. It was rare for someone in his position to admit such things, especially so openly. "It's not just about laws for me," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of passion that made her words resonate. "It's about people's lives. The law is supposed to protect people, but sometimes it feels like it's working against them. We get caught up in the fine print, in the technicalities, and forget that behind every statistic, there's a person. There's a family. There's a story." Judge Parker's gaze softened as he listened. For the first time, he felt a deep empathy that went beyond his usual professional detachment. He had spent years enforcing the law, but this was different. This was about human beings, real, living people whose struggles were often overlooked in the pursuit of justice. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I've always seen the law as something separate from the people it affects. I never thought about how it might be failing them, how it might be hurting them." There was a long pause before Tasha spoke again. "That's why the work I do is so important. If we don't fight for change, if we don't make people see the humanity behind the policies, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes." Judge Parker sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time, he realized how narrowed his view of the law had been. It wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was about people, and it was about ensuring justice wasn't only a concept, but something that worked in practice for everyone. "I think I've learned more in this conversation than I have in years of sitting in courtrooms," he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "And I think I want to help. If you'll let me, I'd like to be a part of this fight for change." Tasha smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. This meeting, this moment, had the potential to be something much bigger than either of them had imagined. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the law could evolve, shaped by the stories that truly mattered. The weeks that followed the cafe meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter in both Tasha and Judge Parker's lives. What started as an unexpected conversation about law and its human impact soon blossomed into a partnership that neither of them had anticipated. Judge Parker, once a man of rigid legal boundaries, found himself drawn into Tasha's world, a world of advocacy, passion, and the tireless fight for justice. He began attending meetings with her, sitting in on strategy sessions, and even helping her refine the language of the National Gun Safety Bill. At first, Tasha was cautious. She had been in the fight for so long that she had learned to trust only a select few. But Judge Parker's sincerity was undeniable. He didn't just nod along with her ideas. He questioned, challenged, and offered insights that she hadn't considered. It wasn't just his legal expertise that made him an asset, but his newfound understanding of the personal stakes involved. Judge Parker, on the other hand, began to see the law in an entirely new light. It wasn't just about the rules and the order they imposed. It was about creating an environment where people could truly thrive, free from harm. His previous detachment from the human side of justice had started to melt away. He found himself speaking out more passionately at meetings, even pushing for stronger provisions in the bill. His voice, once a quiet one in the legal community, was starting to have weight. Their collaboration was met with mixed reactions. Some of Tasha's allies were hesitant, wary of the judge's past and his long-standing ties to the legal system. They questioned whether a man who had spent his career upholding laws that many viewed as outdated could truly support the kind of change Tasha was fighting for. But Tasha's belief in the process and in the potential for change kept her focused. She knew that every battle required unlikely allies, and Judge Parker, despite his initial reservations, was becoming one of her most passionate supporters. In one pivotal meeting, Judge Parker took the floor and spoke directly to a group of conservative lawmakers who had been holding out on the bill. "You have to look beyond the numbers and the data," he urged. "This isn't just about statistics. It's about the families that are being torn apart. It's about the children who are dying. I've seen too many lives destroyed to stand by and do nothing. This bill is a chance to make a real difference." His words left the room silent. Some of the lawmakers exchanged uneasy glances, but there was a shift in the air. The judge's sincerity had pierced through the typical political rhetoric, and for the first time, they saw the human cost of their inaction. For Tasha, the moment was a turning point. Judge Parker was no longer just the judge who had fined her for speeding. He had become an integral part of her fight. Together, they were building something bigger than themselves, a coalition of change, powered by empathy, collaboration, and a shared desire to protect future generations. As the weeks turned into months, their efforts began to yield results. The bill, once stalled, was slowly gaining traction. The seeds of change were being planted, and the groundwork for a safer future was being laid, one conversation at a time. The day the gun safety bill finally passed through Congress, Tasha stood in the middle of a crowded press room, her heart racing with a mix of pride and disbelief. The fight had been long, filled with countless setbacks, sleepless nights, and moments where she questioned whether this day would ever come. But now, standing among lawmakers, activists, and media members, she knew that all the struggles had been worth it. The bill was a monumental victory, one that would save lives and ensure future generations lived in a safer, more accountable society. As the applause echoed around her, Tasha's eyes found Judge Parker in the back of the room. He stood there, a quiet but unwavering presence, his face reflecting the same mixture of pride and humility that she felt. In the months since their partnership had begun, he had become one of her most dedicated allies. His experience in the legal system, combined with his newfound compassion, had proven invaluable. Together, they had pushed through resistance, built bridges across political divides, and finally changed the law. Tasha made her way through the crowd toward him. When they met, she could see the weight of the journey reflected in his eyes, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had done something that truly mattered. "We did it," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Judge Parker nodded, his voice soft but steady. "No, you did it. I was just honored to be a part of it." Tasha shook her head. "We did this together. You gave me a chance to show you the truth. And you made that truth known to everyone else. Without you, this wouldn't have happened." The judge gave a brief, knowing smile. Sometimes the hardest thing is realizing that change isn't just about doing your job the way you've always done it. It's about looking at things with a new perspective and having the courage to act on that. Tasha paused, reflecting on how much they had both changed in such a short time. She had never expected that a chance encounter in a courtroom would lead to a partnership that would shake the future of gun safety. But here they were, standing side by side, united in their belief that the law should protect people, not just enforce rules, but truly safeguard the lives of those it served. The success of the bill was not just a victory for Tasha and Judge Parker. It was a victory for every person whose life had been touched by gun violence. It was a victory for Marcus, her cousin, whose death had sparked this journey. It was a victory for families who could now breathe a little easier, knowing that steps had been taken to prevent future tragedies. As the press conference drew to a close and Tasha made her way out of the room, she felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't known she was capable of. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, but now, with the law behind her, she knew that change was not only possible, it was already happening. And for the first time in years, she felt hopeful that the world her children would grow up in would be just a little bit safer. And as for Judge Parker, his legacy would no longer be defined solely by the sentences he had handed down in courtrooms, but by the lives he had touched, the change he had fostered, and the justice he had helped bring to those who needed it most.